Welcome back to season 3 of Outgrowing a Good Christian Girl. This season is all about living a deconstructed life and what that means. And today, episode 5, we are talking more about church hurt. We're actually talking with one of my friends, Brittney Moses, who came on the podcast last season as well. She is incredible in her insights with mental health and faith and how they intersect. And today we're talking with her about the psychology of deconstruction and recovering from religious harm. If you've ever felt burned by the church or seen spiritual abuse or manipulation happening to somebody else, this episode is for you. So Brittney is a Los Angeles mental health author, creator, and advocate. She's a graduate of psychology at UCLA while research assisting at their Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Behavior in the CAPS lab, and is currently in the clinical psychology program at Pepperdine. As I said, she's amazing. She aspires to encourage those who are quietly wrestling in the shadows by bringing mental health issues into the light and making them accessible and relatable. When she's not writing posts for her popular blog, BrittneyMoses.com, or hosting the Speaking Our Minds podcast, Brittney is on the California beaches, painting or spending time with her son Austin and her husband Jason. So I want to give you a teaser from today's conversation. Here it is.
I really want to encourage people to get back in touch with their bodies, because a part of what happens with religious traumas is that people are often disconnected from themselves, from their bodies, from their intuition. And that's part of what led into the harm, is that you weren't connected to yourself. You didn't trust yourself. You put all of this autonomy and focus on what everyone else was saying. So when we're thinking about healing trauma, even religious trauma, it is important to kind of go slow and to ease into it. I think it is that fear and control that makes you think, oh my gosh, I have to have my beliefs figured out right away. I have to know exactly what church I'm going to be in. I need to make sure I'm exactly back in my Bible doing these things. You're trying to go back to what you were. And I don't think you can, because I think you've expanded and evolved at this point. You're just kind of integrating all your experiences forward. And I think when we understand how trauma and harm works, not just on an emotional level, but literally on a physiological level, we would just have a lot more compassion for people needing to move slowly.
There is so much good stuff here about how do I heal from church hurt? What's going on? Why is deconstruction so uncomfortable? What's the psychology? What is happening in my physical body? This episode is amazing. As always, we want to start off with a word from our sponsors this season, BetterHelp, because deconstructing your faith is stressful. When you're rethinking what you've taken for granted, or asking questions about how we understand scripture, or trying to heal from church hurt and find a healthy community, it can feel really overwhelming. The thing that helped me the most on my deconstruction journey was therapy. It gave me space to process my thoughts instead of avoid the discomfort, and it gave me a wise sounding board where I could safely share my questions and not be afraid of going off the deep end. That's where our sponsors BetterHelp come in. They will match you with a licensed, experienced therapist, usually within 48 hours of signing up, which is amazingly fast. If you'd like a Christian therapist, you can just choose that option on the sign-up form and then let your therapist know how involved you'd like faith to be in your sessions, if at all. You can meet with your therapist from anywhere in the world because your sessions are all online. And if you don't connect with your first therapist, you can always switch to another. This takes away the headache and stress of trying to line up a therapist on your own. So if you too are deconstructing your faith, check out betterhelp.com/Tiffany Dawn for 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that's betterhelp.com/Tiffany Dawn. And now for today's amazing episode with Brittney Moses. Here we go. Brittney, I am so excited to have you back on the podcast. Thank you for being here and making time for this.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be back.
Me
I love
too.
the work that you've been doing and hearing your story online and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And last year's, or I guess it was a couple years ago now when you came on, it was just amazing. And all my viewers should go listen to that one too. But I want to dive into more of this idea of deconstruction and the psychology behind it, and church hurt and healing and all that with you today. So I'm so excited to talk about those things with you. But before we get into that, I want to ask just one personal question. I've been starting every interview this season by asking my guests about deconstruction. I know it's a word that's a buzzword and means different things to every person. So I'm curious, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's so ironic because I feel like we're in a time where we are deconstructing the word deconstruction, right?
That's so true.
It's like, what does that even mean? And that's
Yeah,
essentially
yeah.
what it is, right? It's taking apart an idea, where does it come from? Why has
Mm,
it persisted? Does it hold up to be true? Is this the only perspective? To understand its meaning. It's also just looking at ideas that we've assumed to be true that have been passed down to us or
mm,
have been, historically constructed over time through discourse. So,
mm,
you know, from a kind of a psychological background, the term deconstruction, it originated primarily from the French philosopher. I want to say his name right, but it's Jacques Derrida.
Ooh,
And,
very fancy. Yes.
yes, he introduced the concept of deconstruction in the 20th century as a
Mm,
means for analyzing a text. But the
mm,
idea has been going on for centuries, maybe under different terms. And so it's just kind of analyzing and questioning socially established beliefs, systems, and texts. And that has a much longer history. So to
mm,
me, deconstruction is in a kind of epistemology, and that's basically the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How
mm,
has that been gathered? And what is the reasoning behind it? Is it or isn't it justified? And
mm.
so for me, it's interesting because even though this word has been kind of circulating in the Christian world, we understand that, in terms of people's personal beliefs, we understand that this word is used like in so many other contexts outside of the
Mm,
Christian world. People can deconstruct, um, societal norms, laws, systems in society. People can deconstruct their identity, such as like,
mm,
their gender, ethnicity, culture. Like, what does that mean to them? How does that make
mm,
them who they are? In terms of like their socio-cultural context in the world. People can deconstruct historical narratives and looking
mm,
back in the ways in which history was constructed, or even scientific theories and paradigms can be deconstructed,
mm.
in the field of science or engineering. Language. What do people mean by the word deconstruction? We're deconstructing that idea. So,
Yeah.
it's interesting that that word for some has been so threatening, or it's been such like a buzzword when we realize that it's actually bigger. It's a word that's used bigger than the church.
Mm,
And it's something that's been going on for a really long time. Even when I think about church history, like we think
yeah.
it's high stakes to talk about deconstruction now. But I think about the religious wars in Europe in 16th and 17th century, where you
Mm,
were persecuted and even executed for not holding a certain doctrine of beliefs.
yes.
You think about the wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, or,
Mm,
in the early 17th century, where you could be killed for translating the Bible into English because they believed that only, the religious authorities and clergy should be able to translate scripture. And
mm,
also, it was a threat to hierarchical power, people having the Bible. Or even as recent as something like slavery, where there were
mm,
biblical texts that supported things like slavery, but we deconstructed that because we
mm.
realized that isn't ethical,
Right.
even though it's in the text. And so I think, that's what it is with deconstruction. It's saying,
Mm,
this is what's been handed to us, this is what's been socially constructed, but is it ethical? Like, is it true? Even though something is permissible biblically, doesn't mean that we are to carry it over in today's modern times. If we were able to do it with something culturally like slavery, why not these other areas that are unfair, unjust, or unethical that are being
mm.
supported biblically, right? So I know that's a long-winded answer, but that's what I think of when I think of deconstruction. And I think it's very difficult when you have some people who are trying to gatekeep Christianity and saying that if
Mm,
you're a true Christian, you only believe these certain things, when the truth is that there is a spectrum of beliefs within the Christian faith,
mm,
from people who still carry the character and ethic of Christ. And
mm.
so Yeah, I think we just need more space and room to think and grow in the church in the ways that we've even evolved to today.
Mm, that is so good. I love how that just like normalizes it. Like this has been happening. This is normal. This is part of our faith. It's like a built-in part of our faith, which is
Yes.
amazing. But you're right, like people gatekeep it. And I can't wait to talk later in this interview about this fear that we have of being deceived. When we're
Mhm.
thinking about these certain questions we're not allowed to think about. I'm excited to hear your thoughts on that later in this interview because that was huge for me.
Hmm.
But let's start kind of with a discussion on spiritual hurt first. This is something I hear
Mm.
from so many people who are deconstructing their faith. Many of us feel hesitant about reading the Bible or going to church
Yeah.
because those things can feel so triggering. So I know
Yeah.
you come from both a faith background and a psychology background. So is it
Yeah.
normal for these things to feel triggering? And why does that happen? What does that mean? What is that meant to teach us?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. This is something that I went through my own experience,
Mm,
it's and I think for me it comes back to the idea that the brain is an associative brain. So it
mm,
stores traumatic experiences, whether and when we say trauma, trauma can not only be physical, but it can be emotional, it can be psychological. There's even research that shows that when that psychological pain is registered in the same areas of the brain as physical pain, right? And so our
mm,
body stores this information because its, primary aim is for our survival and for our protection. And so if the Bible or spiritual language or a faith community or environment was intertwined with the hurt and with the
mm.
harm, or even just with the manipulation and abuse that kind of led you into an existential crisis, which can kind of be traumatic to go through in and of
Mm,
itself, right? It can create a lot of panic and anxiety. Um, if all of those things were involved, then yeah, they're associated in your brain. So
mm,
it's difficult to revisit scripture when verses were
mm-hmm.
picked out and contextualized in the use of your harm and manipulation, right? Or again, like if you were in a church and the community played a role in that harm, that high control, that abuse, that manipulation, that hurt, like naturally you are going to feel not just mentally but physically unsafe and skeptical
Mm,
about stepping back into these contexts. And I think when we understand how trauma and harm works, not just on an emotional level, but literally on a physiological level, we would just have a lot more compassion for people
yes.
needing to move slowly, um, when re-looking at these things and
Mm,
really being able to create, what we find is in the healing process being able to create other healthier narratives maybe around scripture or have other healthy experiences like I know we'll talk about later, so that they can have that corrective experience. But
mm.
initially it's very difficult and it's very normal, and there's no shame for anyone who is doing what their body naturally needs to do to move them through the grieving and healing process.
Mm. I think that's so helpful to know just because it reminds me like God made us that way. He gets
Right.
that. Like he made our brain associative like that. That's very like comforting to me.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm
So,
like, it might be God moving you out of the space, you know what I mean?
right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit. When I was growing up,
Hmm.
people often shared the verse about not forsaking assembling ourselves together. And there was this message like, don't miss church. Once you start skipping church, you're going to lose your faith. And candidly, I stopped going to church for a while during COVID.
Yeah.
I never would have had the courage to do that if it wasn't COVID. And so it ended up being a very healing season for me. And
Yeah.
I feel like now I'm able to be back in church after 2 years off of church and in a much healthier space. But again, that was something I was afraid to do. I felt guilty for.
Yeah.
I felt like it was sinning. So can you kind of talk about
Oh.
this? Is it ever necessary to take a break from church and or Bible reading in order to heal? Why or why not? And if we do decide to take a break, how can we do that in a healthy way without losing our faith?
Oh my gosh. Yes. So many components to that. And I agree. I think 2020 with the pandemic, what it did is it kind of forced everyone to slow down in a way that we have never slowed down before. And what happens when you slow down? You start
Yeah.
thinking about things, right? You're
Yes.
starting to think about society and the context and your life and the world you live in, and maybe taking that step away from a church community. Now you're realizing some things that maybe were unhealthy or that you don't really agree with, or, what have you. And that's
Yeah.
actually what tends to happen when people take a step away from communities. And so my first feeling is that God's not going anywhere, right? Like, you just because you're stepping away from a church, it doesn't mean you're stepping away from God. It doesn't mean you're stepping away from Jesus. Some indoctrinations will kind of have you feeling and believing that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that just isn't the case, it's, and so, yeah, so just realizing that, first of all, giving God bigger space in your life, to be in more than one space, especially through the healing process, when you kind of need to break away from these environments that maybe are high control and unhealthy or abusive, manipulative, toxic, and don't really allow for any autonomy. I think that's really important. And so I kind of like to say, it's hard to heal in the same environment that's keeping you sick.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes you need to, I mean, if I wouldn't tell someone who's in an abusive relationship, you know what I mean, that they need to like
Right.
just stay in it and be in it and work in
Yeah.
it from there. It's like, no, you probably need to take a step back to get a clearer picture of like what was really going on, what you were really involved in. And for me, honestly, when I think of these high control environments that are really rooted in fear and shame and control, it kind of reminds me of cults. Like, it's
Yes.
very similar tactics. Like, I'm just gonna say
Yeah.
say
It
it.
does.
It's very similar tactics when you
Yeah.
have these cult-like environments where there is a closed network and they really don't want you to get any outside information or have any outer experiences. They want to completely control your faith experience, your thinking, your, autonomy, like all of that. And all of that is navigated through fear.
Yeah.
Anyone who leaves is demonized or is deceived or is falling away. Like, these
Yep.
are actually very similar to high control cult like environments. And actually, when people leave cults, when people get through whatever amount of time get space away from those cults, it's when all of their kind of reasoning tends to come back and they realize, oh, this doesn't make sense, or this isn't logical, or this isn't ethical, or we shouldn't be operating this way. And they're able to kind of move away from it, and then find something healthier. So, yeah, I think, and I know we'll talk a little bit about like what a healthier environment looks like, but I
Yeah.
think sometimes it's difficult because I definitely was one of those people that are like, well, I need to be a part of the change. Like, you know
Right.
what I
Right.
mean? Like, I need to
Yes.
stay in it so that I can, help try to make change from the inside out. And there's so many verses that are used about like unity and putting kind of the image over the individual and the problems that are happening. Like, you need to stick in it for the unity. If you want to see change, you need to stay in it. And that's very manipulative and just not true. And God cares about you and your well-being, mind, body, soul as well. So yeah, I think it's important to think very holistically
Yeah.
about what life can look like. And that, again, it doesn't mean you're leaving God. It doesn't mean you're leaving Jesus, but it means you're taking the space and time that you need to really process what is going on. And you can always go back if at the end
Right.
of that you decide, no, this was, even though it wasn't perfect, it was really good for me, or I really aligned with, like, you can go back or you cannot. Like, that's the thing. You have that autonomy and you kind of gain that back.
Yeah. That's so good. And it just makes me think like, I wonder if part of what God is doing through all this is like changing the way we think about church. Because honestly,
Yeah.
like a Sunday morning service, that's a very like, this is our Western approach to church. This is not like what church is. And so I think for me, it was like not going to Sunday service for a while. I still had a community of people I was close with and processing with. And like, maybe that can be church. I don't know. This is like a whole other
Yeah.
conversation. But if you have any last minute random thoughts because I'm just throwing this at
No,
you.
I love that actually, because I remember when, especially with COVID, and not being in a physical church as much anymore, um, it actually, I feel like for me, allowed me to connect with God in ways that weren't so structural. And
Mm,
in kind of connecting to what you said about Western thinking, I think that our faith is very like structured and compartmentalized compared to maybe a more Eastern spirituality where it's kind
mm,
of like God is in everything, God is
mm.
everywhere. You can connect with God through your experiences, through
Yeah.
nature, through like it's there isn't a divide between kind of the sacred and the secular. Like
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
it is God. And there are literally verses where God, where it says like in we move and breathe and
Yeah.
live in his being,
Yeah.
so for me actually it created a more expansive faith where
Mm,
it wasn't just regulated to these social structures,
yeah.
but it was pervasive more my it made my faith more pervasive actually, and expansive, and I really appreciate that. And then yeah, church
I love
could
that.
have just been another addition to that in terms of like community. That's been really nice for me.
I love that. Yeah. That's so true. It gives us a bigger picture for sure.
Yeah.
So I know, I think for you, if I remember correctly, but definitely for myself, there, I am back in church at this point and
Mhm.
going to Sunday service. It took me a while though. I had to move kind of slowly. I started off helping in the kids ministry for like a year because I didn't want to be in the service. It made me like too triggered.
Yeah.
It was like hearing different phrases or just songs, even though there's nothing wrong with them. It just would like I'd get so angry, and I just would feel so stressed out and like I didn't want to be there. So I'm curious, what are some tips you have for easing back into
Mhm.
church and or Bible reading if we've taken a break? How do we even know if we're ready to get back to those things? Is there a time
Oh,
when we need to
yeah.
push through hard feelings or like how do we yeah, all that.
Yeah, I like that you said easing into because it really is about going slow. When we talk about trauma, we're thinking about, things coming too fast to you
Mm,
and faster than your nervous system can regulate or that you can really process.
mm,
And that's why part of healing is slowing down and processing to make sense of what's happening. So when we're thinking about healing trauma, even religious trauma, it is important to kind of go slow and to ease into it. I think it is that fear and control that
mm.
makes you think, oh my gosh, I have to have my beliefs figured out right away. I have to know
Yes.
exactly what church I'm going to be in. I need to make sure I'm exactly back in my Bible doing these things. You're trying to go back to what you were. And I don't think you can because I think you've expanded and evolved at this point. You're just kind of
Mm,
integrating all your experiences forward. But in
mm.
terms of returning to those things, I think this is for me where mindfulness comes in terms of just recognizing what you're feeling, like not labeling those feelings as good or
Mm.
bad, not judging them, just realizing, like, oh, that's interesting. Like, that this feeling came up for me physically when I read this verse, or
Mm.
when I re-entered this church, or when I sang this song, or when the pastor said this,
Yeah.
and and I really want to encourage people to get back in touch with their bodies because a part of what happens with religious traumas is that people are often disconnected from themselves, from their bodies, from their
Mm.
intuition. And that's part of what kind of maybe led into the harm is that you weren't connected to yourself. You didn't trust yourself. You put all of this autonomy and focus on what everyone else was saying you need to
Yeah.
think, be, believe, feel. And so now that you're reconnecting with yourself, you're going into this differently because you're now paying attention to your own convictions and your own
Mm.
feelings. And so notice, like, is your heart rate going up? Is your
Mm.
stomach kind of dropping? Do you feel like your muscles are tensing up? And even just notice, okay, my body is sending me messages about something right now. Are you uncomfortable? Are
Mm.
you, whatever it is, just notice. And then later you can kind of decide to revisit or unpack maybe why did this come up for me? And how can I take care of myself, when this happens? Maybe you
Mm.
do need to decompress in the experience in therapy, or decompress it with a safe person, a friend, or a loved one. And so one of the things that we understand about religious programming, especially when it comes to it being involved in our harm, is that it doesn't, we kind of still bump up against these indoctrinations and these
Yeah.
rules and these fears. Even though we've come such a way, they're still there. We're still going to bump up against them, and it's not about maybe them going away completely, but it's about recognizing them and caring for ourselves when
Mm.
it does happen, and just being in tune, and
Mm.
reflective. So that's what I would encourage.
And I like that idea of like taking it slow. Like, this is not a
Yeah.
race, there's no rush.
Yes.
Yeah. That's so good. I think that's something I've learned a lot in my deconstruction is that God is not in a hurry. Like I
Exactly.
always thought. Yeah.
God's not going anywhere.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So I know in our interview a couple years ago, you said it can be really important and for healing to put yourself back in a healthy version of the environment you left. Can you
Hmm.
talk about that? I can't even remember the term for it. Is that, I think you mentioned corrective or something like that, but
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. We were talking about a corrective emotional experience, and it's really a kind of cognitive restructuring. So it's this basic idea that you had an experience that was harmful or traumatic, and so your brain stored that memory and its associations with the harm, with the
Mm,
trauma. And so now, when you are re experiencing a similar situation, but in a new way, right, removed from the harm, you are restoring that experience in a new way with positive associations. And
mm,
it kind of lets you know that, oh, okay, like this can be safe, like in the right context with the right people, and it can kind of help, um, yeah, with some of those triggers. So
yeah.
yeah, it's the process of reflecting on new emotions, and reevaluating maybe some of your assumptions about some of these settings. And so they're positive experiences that kind of counteract and contradict the negative ones. And then they now become integrated into this new way of being, or this new way of believing, or this new way of going to church or being around people.
Mm,
And I would say it even is a part of spiritual development and spiritual growth, that you're able to now cultivate a deeper connection with yourself, with God, with your fellow neighbors, with humanity, and with the broader
mm,
universe. And so, yeah, it's this idea that even though when we hurt in community, we can also heal in community. It's
mm.
just finding those versions that are healthier, that allow for your autonomy. And I know we can talk more about that, but I know that's been healing
Yeah.
for me as well. I've experienced both. And I think
Mm,
that also makes you a more integrated and nuanced person too, to say, you know what? Yes, there's some harm in this, but there's also some good in this. I can recognize all of it and have space for
yeah.
all of it. Um, and it allows you to kind of also honor and respect where everyone is, like
Mm.
in their faith, because you realize it's not a black and white experience.
That's so good. So let's dive right into that healthy church idea. What are some signs
Hmm.
of a healthy church? And how do we figure that out before we get too invested? Especially like
Yeah.
if we've only been there a few times and we don't want to like be there for a year and then find out it's not healthy. Do you have any tips for figuring this out?
Yeah, that's it's interesting because it is gonna take some time, like
Mm,
to know, right? And even for me, it was like, well, I'm just gonna keep going and seeing, right? You don't have to make any commitments. You don't have to become a member. You don't have to start volunteering. You don't have to like, if you're anyone's like all or nothing like me, where I
same.
know
Yep.
whenever I'm like, oh, I've got to do this, I've got to be involved with that, I've got to, you
Yes.
know what I mean? And it's like, okay, wait, like slow down. Like you
Mm,
don't have to jump all in right away. Take
yeah.
the time to like assess it out. And so when I think about a healthy church, and even just thinking about like the church that I've been going to, there is an autonomy, right? There is allowance for, I believe, people to have a spectrum of thought and beliefs within the
Mm,
church, right? There is healthy individuation. So
mm,
individuation is the idea that, or I should say healthy differentiation. It's the idea that we are able to be in connection with others while also still remaining connected to ourselves and our
Mm.
identity, our convictions, our thoughts, our values, right?
Mm.
So we are not kind of abandoning ourselves to take on and enmesh with what other people automatically think, feel, and believe. We can consider it, we
Right.
can dialogue with it, we can be respectful, we can add to one another,
Mm.
but we are still allowed our sense of self. So
Yeah.
I believe that's really important. Also, I believe that is just healthy in terms of having multiple voices at the table and bringing diversity of
Mm.
perspectives to a community. So
Yeah.
I love what we do at my church. Actually, they ask a question at the beginning of the service, and then everyone kind of like turns their chairs into groups or turns around into groups
Cool.
within the
Uh-huh.
service, and then kind of like has 5 minutes to kind of go around and like discuss whatever the topic is. And then everyone might kind of like, and then when we're done, then the pastor might ask, so what did you guys talk about in your group? And then
Wow.
everyone might pop up and share something, and it's so nice because it gives a community feel. Like one of the things that they do is kind of like break down the hierarchy in the sense of like everyone here has God in them and has a
Mm.
voice and has a thought and has something to add to the community.
Mm.
So kind of like opening that up, which I really, really love. So there
Mm.
is autonomy, there is allowance for a spectrum of thought and for differences. Also, a big one I think is accountability. So there's checks and balances, especially when it comes
Mm.
to authority. With things like church and institutions, there's naturally kind of a hierarchy that's in place. And unfortunately, whenever there are hierarchies, there can be abuses of power. Like
Mm.
that is just how that can come about,
Yeah.
and churches are in a unique position where they're very vulnerable to authoritarian, totalitarian type styles of leadership, kind of
Mm.
cult like behaviors, because of the way that it's structured, where you have someone saying, kind of, I am the voice of God, or I have the interpretation of God, and you
Mm.
are putting it on other people, or and you're also trying to like kind of maybe control a community into a sense of conformity, right? So it kind
Mm.
of primes these things to happen.
Yeah.
So it's so important to have some type of either a board or, some type of checks and balances, maybe above, that pastor, or maybe
Yeah.
there's more than one teaching pastor or what have you, right?
Mm.
Because unfortunately, when it comes to church abuse, if that leader is kind of the center of what keeps that church alive and going, and
Yeah.
it's needed for the central functioning of that church, that one person, then yeah, if something goes wrong or if there's a scandal, and that can mean the downfall of that church, or therefore the downfall of like finances, if they have people on staff, right? Like all
Mm.
these things, it can be
Yeah.
a big motivator for cover-ups or to kind of hush victims and keep that person on top, because so much of the church's functions and livelihoods are centered around this one personality. And
Mm.
so I think really making sure there's something in place where, even that authority can be held accountable, or there are consequences, right? Yeah. And then I think understanding their limits of expertise. So
Mm.
this can happen as well, where you'll have someone from the pulpit speaking all on just all kinds of topics, from kind of their own construction of opinion of biblical understanding,
Yeah.
whether it's mental health or
Yeah.
even like sexuality or
Yeah.
like all these identity. Like we're talking about really core topics, even though
Mm.
there's no expertise like
Right.
in these areas that people have, that
Yeah.
if you actually don't get this right, it could be very detrimental to people's livelihoods, right?
Mm.
So I think understanding having an understanding of areas of limited expertise or bringing other experts in is
Mm,
really important when it comes to some of these topics. Because I know I saw that take place a lot.
yeah.
Having that humility to say,
Yeah.
okay, even though I have this role, there's still a limit in my role, and as we make the Socratic oath as mental health experts to do no harm at the end of the
Mm,
day, and to only stick with what we know and what our expertise is.
mm,
And lastly, humanity over dogma, I think, is a really
mm,
big one for me when it comes to a healthy church experience, that we are putting people first. Like, we are
mm,
putting human beings first over, legalism, law,
mm,
rules. Like, we are able to connect with the human first, because I believe that's what Jesus did over and
mm,
over and over again. I think that is a Christ-like ethic.
mm.
Um, and it's really sad when relationships and humanity gets lost in the kind of rigor and dogma of maybe fundamentalism. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's not pretty or nice and it's
Yeah.
felt. So yeah.
I think that's a really good distinction, like humanity over dogma, because it really, our faith, I think, in a lot of ways has almost been boiled down to like what we believe, which,
Exactly.
which is not how Jesus boiled it down. Like, you'll know they'll know you're my disciples by how you love each other, not by your right beliefs. Like,
Exactly.
what do? You love God, you love others. Like, yeah. So I think, but because of that idea of it being all about believing the right things, I think one of the
Right.
main struggles we have is that fear of being deceived that I mentioned at the beginning.
Oh
You
gosh,
know,
yeah.
many of us being warned our whole lives, and we don't want to have the wrong theology and be deceived and miss God. So, what are your thoughts on those fears? How do they affect our faith and our mental health? And how do we move out of that fear based
Oh,
Christianity into something that's more, like you said, expansive?
that's so scary, especially
Mm,
when you have such high stakes things like hell and
right.
salvation, and
Yeah.
you're talking eternity. Like, you're talking about very high stakes
Yes.
um
Yeah.
things that, I mean, even hearing that, it's like, yeah, it's totally connected to my nervous system and
Mm,
my human protective instinct. I want to
yeah.
save my soul, of course, like,
Right. Yeah.
and so when you have these really heavy, high control, heavily shamed based, fear based, like, indoctrinations,
Mm,
oh my gosh, yes, it's a huge means of control. I mean, again, there was a time in history where people believed they had to pay for their sins to keep their salvation, right?
mm,
It's like,
mm-hmm.
this can be really manipulated. Like,
Yeah.
whether or not you believe this is real, we can recognize that something this high stakes can easily be manipulated for control and for kind of thought stopping, which is
Mm,
like, I'm gonna make sure I just don't even, like, think outside of what I'm told,
right. Yeah.
again, cult like behavior.
Yeah.
If
Which
I'm
leads to so much like
honest.
stress in yourself,
Oh
like feeling like
gosh.
you can't go there. Yeah.
Yeah, like, oh my, like, the second that I do, I'm just gonna slip into total deception and
Mm.
Satan's grips,
Yes. Yep.
and I'm doomed for hell in the grave. Like,
Yeah.
so that's terrifying, for
Yeah.
one, for
Yeah.
sure. And I think there's when I talk about this, I always like to talk about there are other existing narratives when it comes to God and faith that are
Mm.
very prevalent, such as the fact that perfect love casts out fear,
Mm.
and I believe that when our faith is rooted in fear and control, I sometimes wonder, like, how authentic is it if it
Mm.
unravels so quickly once you remove the constraint of fear and shame? Like, was
Mm.
it actually socially constructed?
Mm.
Also, this idea, the one true perfect theology, kind of boggles me, because we know logically, like, there's over 200 denominations within the
Mm.
US, within the church. There's over 40,000 different denominations within the world,
Mm.
and so there again is a spectrum of thought within Christianity. And
Yeah.
if it was so straightforward, a lot of people like to say, well, this is the biblical truth,
Right.
and what they're really saying is, like, well, this is actually their interpretation, or this is
Yeah.
their doctrine. Because if that was the case, then we wouldn't be having so many branches of thought, because the truth
Mm.
is that there are other ways of interpretation that people have come to and believe wholeheartedly that theirs is the true one,
Yeah.
you know? So for me, I think this is where it's really important to actually kind of simplify our faith that I
Hmm.
found, which is like sticking with the basics, you know?
Mm.
My favorite verse is Galatians 13:10 that says, "Love does no wrong to others, so love fulfills the requirements of God's law." Like
Hmm.
love fulfills God's law. At the
Mm.
end of the day,
Yeah.
living, abiding, operating in love toward God, self, and others, which is, loving God and others, crux of the Ten Commandments that Jesus
Mm.
said, all of them are based on that.
Yeah.
Like loving God and loving others
Yeah.
and looking at the fruits of what these actions and beliefs produce in our
Mm.
lives and in the lives of others
Yeah.
is to me kind of a childlike faith. Like it's telling. It's just like
Mm.
this is how we can be informed. And so how
Yeah.
the question is like how big or how small is our view of God? I
Mm.
tend to have a really big one. And so
Mm.
that tells me that there is room to grow. God created the mind that I think with, the psalm
Mm.
says. So he
Mm-hmm.
understands every thought, you know. I think sometimes we actually create God in our own image, right?
Mm.
This small kind of tribal, you
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
God, which is so man-like, which is so
Mm.
man-made, it doesn't sound anything like a God of the entire universe who made
Mm.
all of creation and all the stars and planets and galaxies and humans throughout
Yeah.
history. That he's, to me, God is too big to be so small and
Mm.
tribal in the way
Mm.
that we do. So yeah, just kind of
Yeah.
having a bigger view of God, getting back to the basics of what Jesus said
Yeah.
and of the fruits of the Spirit, and realizing that the psychology of indoctrination is a real thing, and those of
Mm.
us who are in this work understand how it works. And when
Mm.
you do, it's kind of hard to unsee that there is a system of, making sure that you control people's environments through fear, making sure you control what information is allowed in or is
Mm.
allowed out, making sure that there is social reinforcement within the community, that everyone is affirming these, that there's kind of this echo chamber and group think. It
Yeah.
makes it really hard to think otherwise when that is your environment and it's socially reinforced, and there are really high repercussions for thinking, outside of the group or outside of exactly what you're told, right?
Mm.
If there's punishment, even if it's social ostracism,
Mm.
or social rejection,
Yeah.
losing your community, which is like your whole life and your social
Yeah.
well-being is dependent on it. I mean, there's so much that's dependent on this.
Mm.
And recognizing that, like, yeah, that could very well be at work. And yet it's not the only reality that exists.
Mm.
Um, but it's kind of how indoctrination works, is kind of keeping people in place through fear to keep the hierarchies in place.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny because a few months ago, someone was talking with me about my childhood, and they're not religious at all. And I made this comment off the cuff, like half joking, like, yeah, I basically grew up in a cult. And I was like, I'm
Yeah.
just kidding, I didn't really. But then I started thinking about it. I'm like,
You're like,
there's a
wait,
lot of cult-like qualities in the
very
environment I grew up
similar.
in. Yeah, and it
It's
was
funny
like,
too, because
yeah,
my best friend grew up non-religious, and sometimes when I explain things to her, like when you explain them to someone who's not been in that
yeah,
experience and you're saying it out loud, you're
right,
realizing like, oh wait, this is kind of strange.
yeah,
Like, oh wait, this is weird. This is kind of culty. Yeah,
yeah,
like
yeah. But you just it
again,
seems
being
so
exposed
normal.
outside of that,
Yes,
like that community or that group, you're just like, oh wait.
yeah,
Yeah,
that
that's a
was not
little,
normal. Yeah.
that wasn't normal. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally hear that. I guess one last question before I wrap up with my final two questions.
Yeah.
So three more questions. Is
Good.
do you have any last like tips on
Mm.
coping skills or things to help yourself as you're trying to heal or as you're putting yourself back in these environments? Is there anything that you'd say this is important to try?
Oh gosh, like we mentioned, there can be a lot of triggers. So maybe you need to like mute some things,
Okay.
on
Yeah.
on social media where you're
Uh-huh.
just like, ooh, this theology or this you know, what this person's saying is so harmful or hurtful, or it's re-triggering all these things, this dogma,
Mm.
this whatever. Like, maybe in order for those wounds to heal, you need to like take a break from some
Mm.
of those voices. And I know it's hard, especially if they're like your friends or family or people that are really close.
Mm.
Just consider, I guess, what I'm saying, what your boundaries need to be,
Yeah.
and consider what your boundaries are going to be around conversations too, because you might have people that are like grilling you about what you believe now, or are shaming or concerned or what have you. And just know that you have the autonomy to say, hey, listen, I'm still figuring some things out, or,
Mm.
I have my own thoughts, my faith is growing, like it's expanding, and
Mm.
it's been good for me, and you can set a boundary on what you do and don't want to share and say,
Mm.
I actually would rather not talk about these things right now,
Yeah.
but I see your concern. I appreciate it. I get why you are, but I'm not concerned. I'm doing fine. And if there's anything else I want to share with you, I will. Like,
Mm.
you have the
Mm-hmm.
right to have boundaries around the conversations that you have while you're going through this process. You have the right to, take care of yourself through some of these triggers. I think therapy is really, really great
Mm.
because
Agreed.
especially if you're dealing with like heavy, toxic, harmful indoctrination, like,
Yeah.
and something that's been repeated throughout your whole life. I mean,
Right.
that's so ingrained. You probably do need to go through some therapy to
Yeah.
revisit like where this came from, what, getting reconnected to yourself. What do you really think, feel, believe about these things?
Mm.
Learning how to trust yourself again, because maybe you haven't ever.
Mm.
Um, there's just a lot of skills that I think that we can lose when we're in high control religious environments, that have been stunted because we weren't allowed to do things like think critically for ourselves, or,
Right.
listen out for our own intuition, or trust ourselves, or allow our thinking to expand and develop according to like normal stages of development as you get older, right? And or like
Right.
emotionally develop. A lot of people are like emotionally stunted because they were told their
Mm.
emotions are connected to, a spirit of depression or a spirit of anger, right? Like,
Mm.
there are these very normal, natural human parts of healthy development that get stunted and infantilized and like stuck
Yeah.
in these environments that you may need to process now.
Mm.
So that's why I recommend things like therapy, and yeah, just again, go slow and know that you are allowed to have this process, and that God is big, like,
Mm.
and God can hold space for all of it.
Mm. I think that's so good to just remember that God is big
Yes.
enough. Like, we need to
Yes.
remember that. Yeah.
And we're not asking any new questions. Like,
Right.
you
Right.
know,
Yeah. This is Natalie. She's my
Hi,
5-year old.
Natalie.
And she's whispering in my ear, Ellie fell on the playground and cut her face, Mom.
Oh, oh no.
It's bleeding.
Oh,
Thank you for telling me.
ouchies.
Yeah. I'll get her in just a little bit. Daddy's got her now. So, as we wrap up this interview, I have two final questions. First is
Yeah.
going to that bird's eye view again. So, part of
Mhm.
deconstruction is asking what parts of my faith do I bring forward with me and what parts do I leave behind? So, I'm asking all my guests, do you have any examples of that in your own life that you'd feel comfortable sharing with us?
Yeah, I love this so much because I think that sometimes people think that they have to throw the baby out with the bathwater or go
Yeah.
to that all or nothing. And some people
Yeah.
do. I had a season where I like went into nihilism. I'm like, does anything
Mm.
matter? Like, so some people go into like an atheist phase where because
Mm-hmm.
because literally they get to a point where it's like, I was told all these things. This
Yeah.
wasn't true. This didn't add up. This didn't. So now, wait, what was true? Like,
Yeah.
what? And they kind of sometimes have to deconstruct everything and
Mm.
reconstruct everything.
Mm.
But what I have found is that the same things that led me into faith and into
Mm.
following Jesus were the same things that led me into my beliefs evolving. So they're
Mm.
usually guided by love. They're usually guided by something that doesn't seem ethically right. Like
Mm.
they're usually guided by kind of like justice or just like care for neighbor regardless of our differences. And so
Yeah.
I found that the beliefs or thought processes that have changed or evolved are actually still rooted in the same core things that led me to my faith
Mm.
and kept me in my faith.
I
So
love
I
that.
really do trust that. And I love that,
Mm.
especially when sometimes you feel like you might regret, like, going through this process or regret, like, was it all a waste? And it's like, actually,
Yeah.
no. Like,
Yeah.
what are the parts that led you there? Because those parts are probably still core to your values. Like,
Mm.
the reasons that you follow Jesus or started going to church are probably still core values that are a part of your walk. So for me, it's so funny. Not me pulling out a list, but
I
I
love that
I'm
though.
not going to read the whole list, but I'm
Oh, you're
so glad you brought that up
feel
because
free to.
that was part of my practice actually. Was I literally made, and I recommend this, I made
Mm.
like took a piece of paper and I made like two tables, right? I did a line down the middle and did two tables, and on one side it was things I want to bring with me, and on the other
Mm.
side it was things I want to leave behind.
Wow, I
um
love that.
so I think
Yeah.
that's a great practice because again, it's about integration. It's about integrating all of your values and experiences and lessons forward. So for me,
Mm.
like things I want to bring with me, being set apart by love, right?
Mm.
The value of community, the fruits of the spirit,
Mm.
loving and accepting the outcasts, love for neighbor as self, justice and caring for the underprivileged. Um, every life as sacred and worthy,
Mm.
all people reflecting God's divine image, Sabbath and the need for rest,
Mm.
living for something bigger than myself, the sanctity of marriage, the importance of family
Mm.
being your first ministry and putting your family first, right? So, there's so many actually that I
Yeah, that's a
realize
lot.
I'm
Yeah.
like, there's so many things that are still such a big value to me. And this is actually
Mm.
why I was led into my faith, right?
Mm.
And then the things I want to leave behind, I put, black and white thinking.
Yeah.
I want to give
Yeah.
myself room to think and grow, or othering people into them being lost or enemies of
Mm.
the faith. I don't want to other people anymore.
Mm.
Leaving behind fear, shame, control, self-righteousness,
Mm.
hyper religiosity, you know, condemnation of people because of their sexuality or their
Mm.
beliefs, the need for assimilation, so conformity in order
Mm.
to belong, and
Mm.
having that kind of superiority complex. Patriarchy was a big one for
Yeah.
me. I
Sure.
was like, oh, um, certain aspects of purity culture, body and sex shame,
Mm.
sacrificial burnout, spiritual bypassing, blanket
Mm.
statements, not being able to trust myself, needing to rely on external sources or authority figures for affirmation of what I know
Mm.
is true. So like, yeah, so that's a
That's
very helpful
amazing.
I have so many, but like
That is
that's actually a
powerful.
helpful practice. Just sit there and
Yeah.
make like a line down a page in two columns, write down
Yes.
the things you want to keep and you're taking with you that are valuable to you, and the things that you're leaving behind because they did not produce good fruit in your
Yeah.
life and the
Yeah.
lives of others. And I actually think that's very biblical. So
That's awesome. Thank you for
yeah,
sharing that. I love that. I
absolutely.
love that. And I love the things you had on there too. So as we close with my little junior assistant peeking over my shoulder, for those of you who are listening instead of watching, my daughter is grinning over my shoulder, um,
So
full of
cute.
energy. So lastly, you have a ton of resources for people who are
Oh,
struggling
yeah.
with mental health and trying to reconcile that with their spiritual journey. So can you tell us about your
Mm.
resources and where my listeners can find you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of just like mental health resources on my website, brittneymoses.com. There's a tab that says mental health, and those are general mental health resources, also culturally based mental health resources. And there are also actually resources there for cases of like spiritual abuse or things like that. Third party, like Grace, which is an organization that
Yes.
helps bring third party resources in cases of spiritual abuse. So, all of that is in there as well as just like crisis lines and stuff. But in terms of those who are going through maybe deconstruction and reconstruction, and still, keeping their faith, I think a great book is Faith After Doubt by by Brian McLaurin.
Okay.
That's a great one, as well as recently Sarah Bessey came out with Field Notes for the Wilderness,
Oh,
Practices for an
yes.
Evolving Faith.
I just
That
started
was
listening to that.
It's so good. And then there's like the Bible for Normal People with Pete Enns and Jared Bias. And all these
Yes.
people have podcasts. These things are both educational and just really validating to your experience.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who are not only going through what you're going through, but have through all of history. Like none of
Yeah.
this is new, despite the narrative that's out there. This is not new. So we are just part of an evolving history of being human, and this is a part of it.
I love that. Sorry, I'm
It's okay.
being attacked.
As a mom, I get it.
And I don't want to stop you like, sweetie, please stop, because then that's on the recording too. These are awesome resources, though. Thank you so much. And definitely check out Brittney's website and all her posts.
Yeah, we have our podcast. I need
Yes.
to say that. I have my own podcast, which is the Speaking Our Minds podcast, and we actually specifically focused on deconstruction and evolving beliefs this month, and we got into the psychology of all that. So,
oh
yeah,
my gosh.
Want more on
Yes,
this?
I will
talk
link
about
that
all these
in
things.
the notes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brittney. And to all my listeners, thank you for being here. And I will see you next week for another episode of Outgrowing the Good Christian Girl.